you. So I want to promise you that whatever you were just doing, this is going to be better. No pressure or anything. So everybody has their programs, right? And you've got the bios in it, because I'm not going to do the formal bios for these two guys. And the reason for that is you just can't do formal bios for these two guys. I mean, they're both, Mauricio and Arnold are two incredibly brilliant, creative people. And as I was telling them, and the planning committee knows that as we were sitting around talking about who should be here today, came up with the idea of Arnold and Mauricio sitting and talking together. And everybody in the room said, wow, that's a great idea, let's do that. So it was sort of like, we don't even care what they talk about, you know, just having these two guys together and just chatting with all of us is going to be great. And one thing that I do want to say about both these guys, and really you could look at their bios and be really impressed because they both are very important people. But the thing that I really want to say in terms of bio and why this seemed like such an important pairing related to what we're all doing today is that both Mauricio and Arnold have done very important things in their lives, and you know, they're like what I think of as community elders in the best sense of that word, people that continue to have a big impact on their community and sort of get bigger in that as they get older. And that's all true, but the thing that really strikes me with both of them is how humble they are, and just having this really strong sense and belief in community wisdom and collective wisdom. And they both believe in that from a policy standpoint. And that's what really made sense to me to sort of get you guys together, because I think that of the people I know, when I think of community wisdom and learning from the people that we're all supposed to be working to help, that you two gentlemen are people that just come to mind first. So I'm just really excited to sit and listen to whatever comes next, and thank you for agreeing to be here.
We're going to talk about Hawaii. Right?
So, it's really an honor to sit here with you. One of my heroes. And I've known you since Asian Neighborhood Design Day. Not that. And it's just been interesting watching you progress throughout, your life and being able to peek in and out on you. I'm going to ask a question. I don't know how relevant this question is, but it's an interesting question. It's 50 years since the war on poverty. What is the war on poverty? What is that about?
I joined the nonprofit sector because of the war on poverty, and I think a lot of us are there because, the issue of poverty just seems really dramatic, and we should do something. You see all the stats and whatever. And I'm a really slow learner. After about 15 years in the nonprofit sector, I came to realize we were asking the wrong question. That I came from a Mexican mother, single mom, 2 kids coming to America, and the issue was never for my mother about getting above poverty and living comfortably, above the poverty level. So her issue was you came to America because it promises mobility if you work really hard, and that didn't happen. And so really the question should have been about economic and social mobility and not about poverty. And so you get all the stats here about poverty and whatever, and we'll go into that a little bit more, but really we should be talking about mobility. If we can't reestablish mobility in this country, we're never going to really impact poverty, which is what the last 50 years of the war on poverty has shown.
So what's the difference between poverty and mobility? I mean, how do you distinguish the difference?
Well, because of the way we put the markers, right? And we look at how many people are above the poverty level, how many people are below the poverty level, that sends a message that really what we need to do is get more people above the poverty level, and somehow they'll be okay if they're above the poverty level. But maybe it was that way historically. If you became working class, you'd be okay in America. That's no longer the case. You're working poor in America, you're lower middle class in America. Actually, a lot of folks in our agencies don't really make enough. You know, one crisis can. So it's just not stable there. So, you know, the issue really is, can we develop really a stable population that is working really hard? But so the issue is, can there be the mobility to really get to independence, not above the poverty level, because that is not stable.
So part of your growing up sounds like involved you ultimately. We don't hear you. You can hear you. Testing. Testing.
Is that okay? No.
I can speak louder.
I'm speaking too loud.
Part of your growing up, I'm sure, led to the Family Independence Initiative.
Yeah.
What was that process for you? I mean, why the Family Independence Initiative?
Okay, that's like 40 years of my life. Okay, we're gonna try to get it really short. So, you know, Mexican mother, 2 kids, immigrated from Mexico to San Jose, California. She was gonna work really hard. Had to work 2 jobs to get above the poverty line, and put my sister in a good school, try to get me into a good school. But my sister, with my mother working 2 jobs, my older sister, she was 6 years older than me, ended up with the wrong kids, got pregnant at 16. The guy was abusive. He took her out of the house, took her to New York, so my mother couldn't help her. And so my mother's sitting there a year into coming to America to make a better life for her 2 kids, and she lost one. Right? And so then it was, I was like about 8, 9, or 10. It's like, Mauricio, this is not going to happen again. Right? And so she then dedicated the rest of her life, which wasn't that long, to making sure that I succeeded. And it wasn't about staying above the poverty line. Gonna take a vote?
You're it.
No. It kind of we just talked, right? Oh, no. So I think what ended up happening is my mother then decided to focus on me, with my responsibility being that I take care of my sister, and by that time, her 3 kids, right? And I lost my mother because the struggle was too hard in this country. And then I, however, became an engineer because she told me I had to be a doctor and engineer because I had to earn money. This is not about what you want to do. It's like you've got to earn some money. And somehow or other, you know, there's been a lot of flukes in my life, and I ended up at UC Berkeley, and I graduated from Berkeley. And when I'd be with my mother and my sister, and we were Mexican, and we were in the neighborhood, you know, people would look at me like I'm not talented and whatever. It was really strange, because then I'd go somewhere and I'd say I graduated as an engineer from UC Berkeley. World was totally different. People treated me different, they saw me different, opportunities were very different. It was very strange to be in these 2 worlds. So then I lost my mother in my mid-20s, and my sister, you know, she's still getting beat up, and all this other stuff happening with her kids. And so I decided to join the War on Poverty, because it seemed like it shouldn't be that hard. You shouldn't have to lose your mother and a sister to have 1 kid kind of make it, right? Because I was like fully independent. And so I ran Asian Neighborhood Design. I look more Asian, so that's the way it happened. How you look, but I ran all my programs out of black neighborhoods.
A Mexican and Asian neighborhood design in a black community.
Yeah, I lost my Spanish, so I was more acceptable in the other neighborhoods. So Latinos.
You know, you said something interesting about having a title, and these are my words.
Yeah. Yeah.
Having a title, so you're just a plain person, and they found out that you, in fact, were an engineer, and then all at once you had status. How does that relate to people in poverty?
Well, you know,
How do we treat them differently?
It's kind of amazing, because, like, again, in my mother's world, you grow up as a little kid hearing these stereotypes, right? And the right wing will say you're lazy. I mean, my mother would say, you know, they think we're lazy and dirty because we're Mexican, right? And so therefore we had to clean everything. We had to be really clean, you know, we had to whatever, because she was fighting this stereotype. And so there's these really heavy stereotypes throughout the whole thing without knowing that you're talented or whatever. I really was a bad engineer, so that wasn't the talent. But I probably had some other talents, but there was no way of showing it if you're low income because you're stereotyped. Yeah? And then on the liberal side, then it's like, well, we make a lot of excuses. Well, life is hard for them. They have bad schools. They're minorities, and our country has not been good to them. And then it's then, but we're going to come and help them. And if we help them, they'll be okay, right? And there's this fight between the right and the left. But if you look at the stereotypes, the same thing. It's like they never thought me, my mother, and my sister were really capable. We either needed somebody to tell us what to do, or we could know what to do, and why waste any resources on you? And the fact is, my mother, she only had a third grade education in Mexico because they just didn't educate women. But she was really smart, and she was very strong and very determined, and very prideful. So she wouldn't go into welfare because it takes my pride away. I lose my respect. And what ended up happening is that as I watched her struggle, I became very proud of her. We didn't have food sometimes, but that didn't matter because I was proud of her, right? And that was the driving force. Then when I was running programs, I ran Asian Neighborhood Design. We had 120 staff, social workers, employment specialists, you name it. I worked in Oakland and San Francisco, and we helped people. We helped a lot of people. And I guess we'll jump to it, but I came to the conclusion that because my sister and her kids were having all the same problems all these families I was trying to help were having, I came to the conclusion now that I was kind of heading towards middle income, that middle income they face all these same problems, but I wouldn't run my nephew and nieces through my programs. What I would do is I'd have them be responsible. They had to go through HEALD, or I would buy what I needed. And a lot of it had to do with that those programs, in order to survive, had to convince me as the consumer that I needed them, right? And when I ran social services, the families had to prove to me that they were needy enough and they needed my direction. And so there was just this contradiction in, if I was going to put other families through, but I wasn't willing to put my own family through, then something must be wrong.
But Maurice, you had all the data and all from Cal, from Harvard, and from USC, and it tells you what to do for poor people. How come you didn't listen to that?
He's setting us up. The guy's really smart. One is, actually, I don't read very much, which is really pretty good. And then engineers aren't really good at that anyway. I wasn't trained. But it didn't make sense. This wasn't common sense, right? So a lot of the studies would say you're supposed to do this and that and whatever. And my mother had a lot of common sense, maybe not education. And the kind of studies and what they said that would motivate her, like giving her financial training or whatever, it didn't really make sense. She didn't want financial. She needed to pay the PG&E bill. She needed some money. And she had to make those decisions. And every week, every month, she was having to deal with a very complex system. But all the programs are structured, And then when she needed, so me as middle income, God, we're really going to mess up. We got to get to the other part of this. But so when I was middle income, because I had money, then with my nephew and nieces, I would buy the services. I needed a mentor, or I needed drug rehab, or whatever. I would buy them when I needed them, and they would try to please me. And so then it's like having this ladder, and you can climb it because you get that next rung. You pay for that next rung. The dilemma I had with the families is that all the services were there, but they couldn't access them when they needed them, right? Because the eligibility criteria, they could get one, and that was great, and they'd say, oh, that's great, but the next rung, well, they had to wait a year, or the program year, or there wasn't enough slots, or whatever. And so it just didn't work. So great, we had all these things, and everything's right, but it isn't under the control of the consumer, and the consumer is the family.
And so how is the family independence? Technical difficulties, folks.
Was said anyway. Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? No? Hello? 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 Will they give us more time? Where was that? I lose track.
how will the family, talk a bit about the Family Independence Initiative. What is that about, and how is that helping people? Social service is there to assist people, to help people. Public health is to help people.
Right.
But your model is somewhat different. So I come into your neighborhood and I kind of tell you what to do and what not to do based upon the last study I had. And so I pretty much know what you need. So, but your model is saying, no, Arnold, you really don't know what I need.
Yeah, I can't say it's a model. Basically, it is a learning project, and it's a learning project from the families as consumers. So if you look at it, is that really what we need to understand is what their lives are like and what they need and whatever. And the dilemma is that they're so diverse that you can never guess all the stuff that's going. So FII was really set up because the part of the engineering that I was okay is I like stats and data, and I set up a data tracking system. So in the early 1990s, I started tracking families' perspective on how they get their own life together. I'd pay them $25 a month to tell us what their life was like the last month, what their kids did, what they did, et cetera. And I developed a data tracking system. So in 1999, then Jerry Brown challenged me to do something, and I told him that he told me I could do anything I wanted to do. Money and resources weren't a problem. He's kind of strange. And
this is true.
But, here's this guy who's pretty powerful, basically saying you could do anything you want to do. And it's kind of like, oh, just for the hell of it, I thought, what could I figure out? And he said, show up at my office the next month and tell him how I would solve poverty, right? And so I was standing in front of him, but he was like, he's getting really real about this stuff, right? And so I standing in front of him and I said, well, I don't really know what I would do, but my mother figured out how to get me out. And for that fact, I think most mothers, fathers, and guardians would have a better chance of figuring how to get their own families out. And I have a data tracking system that I would pay the families monthly, to spend the time to give me what they've done the previous month. That's what I'd done before. And out of that, we're bound to learn something. And he thought that was interesting. So basically, he helped me to start this thing. And that really is what FI is. It's really kind of trying to make that invisible strength that my mother had and whatever, make it visible. Because we don't ask that. If you look at all the stats, we ask about need. We don't ask about strength. My mother actually was a designer. She was a good seamstress. All of these folks actually have these talents. We don't ask about that. We don't invest in that. We keep asking all the needs stuff. And we invest in that.
But see, that's what I'm taught to ask is the need. And how do I get to strengths? I don't know how to get to a person's strength.
Well, okay, so actually that's kind of interesting because like I told you, my mother wouldn't go to a program because when she sat in front of a social worker or a counselor or employment space, they would tell her what she should be doing. They'd ask her first, right? But then they actually would tell her what to do. So I had been working, for 20 years I ran Asian Urban Design, so I knew a lot of the families. I knew that they were going through the cycle. They'd cycle in and out of poverty, and whatever. And so if I was to learn from the families, and I promised Jerry that there would be no counselors, no direction, right? Because you want clean data. You want to know what they could do. So the project was to learn what they could do for themselves and for each other, because there's a whole history of how people have gotten out of poverty. It's really a collective, right? It's a group effort. So in order to understand what people were really capable of doing, I knew my family, I didn't know the other families, then you have to make room for it. And so I'd get a whole group of families that are friends, and I'd say, look, I got Jerry Brown, he's interested in what you would do, not what I would do, not what my staff would do. And so you give us data on what you do every month to get your own life together. It's your culture, your family, your kids, they're all different, and you have to figure. And so my staff was not allowed. So one of the things that happened is that when I first started with a lot of families that have been used to programs, they would actually very directly ask me, because my staff would sit there and they can't say anything, right? And so the families would sit there, so what do you want us to do? And the Samoans were really cool. They went through our website and whatever, and they said, so you want us to do home ownership? Because they saw this. Right. Oh, they have home, the other families did this kind of stuff, right? So the people are trying to guess, right? In order to get access to what we control, they're trying to guess. And my staff is like, just do something.
Right.
And sometimes it kind of lagged for a little bit. But one of the first lessons I got, which made a huge difference, about 7 months into the project, we had enrolled refugees from the war in El Salvador. And, you know, they had no savings. We have a data system that has a baseline and all their income, what their kids are doing, what schools they're in, what their health care is like, all, you know, about 200 data points, right? A really good baseline. And the refugee families were sending all their money and remittances back to El Salvador. They had no savings. And I asked them, so, you know, what if there's a crisis, right? What something else says, well, we'll go back to the village, you know? So they were building assets over there. They didn't feel they could build assets here. And then one meeting, my staff comes back and says, Jorge and his wife, Maria Elena, said they're gonna buy a house. Now, they have no savings. Home ownership was not something in whatever. So I go and talk to them, and they say, well, we ran into the Spanish-speaking broker. He said he could help us buy that house down the street. And so we got our friends to get us some of the money for deposits and whatever, and we're gonna get that house. And my staff comes back and says, you know, he's a predatory lender. Can we talk to the family about that? And I said, no, I promised Jerry, you know, you can't talk. So it's gonna, so, and I knew that, you know, he would make his money on closing. And so sure enough, he got him to closing. And by this time, they'd figured out, this guy, there's something wrong. He wouldn't give him, you know, receipts for the deposit and stuff. And so when they closed, their mortgage was 65% of their income. And my staff comes back and says, they're gonna lose the house. And I'm over there, yeah, they're gonna lose the house. So my staff is kind of pissed at me at that point in time, because I was like, no financial training, no nothing. Let's just see what happens, right? The next thing that happens is that all those families that had helped them with the deposit descended on this house, re-landscaped, retiled it, repainted the damn thing. Then 6 months later, had me sit in, I knew enough Spanish to sit in on the refinance, right? They got their payments down to about 40%. And at that point in time, it was clear they were not gonna lose this house. They had a whole series of families surrounding this house. A year and a half, the other 5 families in that cohort, they all owned homes. The money stopped going to El Salvador. 5,000 came from El Salvador this direction. Jorge Maria Elena changed the expectations of that entire set of communities. If we had come in and saved that one family, everybody would think that the only way this happens is somebody comes in and saves them.
Right.
So that happened time and time again. So after that, I have no problem firing staff that tries to be helpful.
So I see the young lady, but I have about 5 more minutes. So, and so this is creaming, Maurice. You got your friends and people you know who are already doing well, and you just creamed them off and brought them in, and you have this model that works.
Right. He really is setting this thing up. So I'm sitting with Jerry Brown. He says, you better not cream. and so, you know, after 20 years of working in these neighborhoods, and you see the families, you know, their kids were starting to show up in my programs and whatever, you kind of know. And so what we did is we took refugees. You know, we didn't take the immigrant that came in with a lot of hope and a lot of initiative and whatever. We took refugees that are like, you know, I just want to go home. You know, I just came through a war, and send me back. The Mien community was the Asian group. They almost all were on welfare, because again, they came out of the war in Vietnam. And then the African Americans were out of West Oakland and East Oakland. And so then, you know, they were trying to rehab. They were doing a lot of stuff on their own. And so what ends up happening is that the African Americans, their income jumped 37% within 2 years. The Latino income jumped about 22% in 2 years. And the Asian income jumped about 17%. You know, it was like, everything's like, forget it. Just forget all the stereotypes, forget all your expectations, and just let people rise to whatever it is.
So exactly, what is it you're doing? Because I'm a social worker, and my heart is in the right place, and I'm interested in violence and abuse. And what kind of special sauce do you have?
You know, we got to learn how to listen. And we got to understand that these families are the experts of their own lives, and that their culture and their patterns dictate everything. You know, you can't bring that in from the outside, and it's very diverse. And if you want to be helpful, you have to, if you want to even play a leadership role, you have to be a servant leader. You have to be a follower leader. This is not about leading. But all your funders will tell you, you have to lead. They will ask you in an RFP, so what are you, as a social worker at a program, what are you going to do to help them? And this issue of us and them really screws everything up. Until you realize that these families are the ones that have the solutions, and you trust them. Sometimes we wouldn't say anything for 6 months to see what would happen, right? And then this issue, we never actually talked about it, positive deviance, go read about it. You know, when one person, like Jorge and Maria Elena, actually do something, everybody, because it's a peer, they become interested, and it affects the expectations of everybody. And then we just need to make resources available for people to do what they want to do.
But you know, we're trained to be in these power positions. I don't feel like I'm doing anything unless I'm doing something for you, but actually to you. And
Right.
I always say you can't lead where you don't go, because I don't live in that community. And you can't teach what you don't know. Again, I don't live in that community. But I make assumptions about that community based upon what I've read, heard, but I really don't know what it's like. And obviously, you've listened. And that's one thing that we don't know how to do. We don't know how to listen and allow people to tell us what they see, what they want, what they need.
Yeah, I think some of it is you have to listen. The other thing is you got to start collecting different data. If you keep looking at this data, you're going to keep thinking that that's what you got to feed. You're not feeding the initiative. So where FII is going is we're collecting data. We're going to collect thousands, tens of thousands of families. And Walmart, how they look at it is they look at the data and see how you're spending to get more products to you. We're going to look at the data, what families do for themselves and each other and help each other, and we're going to make that public, so that you know that this group of families, and then you then have to sell your services to these families. It should be that it is the demand of the consumer that really drives it. I sound like a capitalist. I'm actually a really leftist. But anyway, so you have to actually look at a different set of data, and so that's what we're really focusing on, is capturing that data. Like if there was a different credit score that actually could capture initiative and resourcefulness and reliability, because the current credit score only helps the rich, right? But if you had a different score that told you that, right? Because you can't listen to everybody. But if it told you these families are reliable, wouldn't you want to invest in that? So that's kind of where we're going.
So there was 2 more minutes, and then I'll say 2 more and 2 more. And so there was some discussion about violence in communities and education. What kind of examples can you give within the communities you work? How
So
intrinsically lives have changed?
It is sort of like if you decide, because I led things for 20 years, and if you decide, you actually want to follow, you get the best experiences. So one of the things that I learned was that there's the Yumien community, which is one of the communities that, and in the mid-1990s, the kids were all shooting each other. Their parents were all on welfare. There was no respect, for their parents. The parents didn't seem engaged. And so there were gang wars going on. And in that period of time, they had a higher incarceration rate than African Americans or Hispanics, right? So you'd see a say chow or say something or other, which is the name on this whole thing. Finally, there was a shooting at some dance, right? And 2 kids were killed, or 1 was killed, I think. And the parents said, there'd been youth programs and whatever trying to stop that. There was a gang task force, and the parents said, enough is enough. We have to come in. So the parents then start talking about, so who are the kids? Who are their parents? They're in Richmond. It was kind of Richmond and Oakland, kids fighting. And so the parents then start meeting with the other parents and whatever. And out of all that, the fact that these kids saw their parents then taking the lead, not the youth program. When those parents stepped up, the respect came back, right? And so then the parents said, okay, we'll need scholarships and whatever. And so all of a sudden, I'd say 15 years later in that community where before it was all gang fights, now the expectation is you go to college, okay? But it takes parents.
A different set of expectations.
It sets this respect, that pride, the thing that my mother was telling me is not, it's me, it's not the social worker, right? Because there were programs offering me more than she could offer me. And when the programs offer more than the parents can, we start replacing them.
So in closing, what would you like the folk out there to walk away with? What is it you'd like them to walk away with?
The biggest thing is maybe don't read as much or look at stats as much because of what's coming out. Look at these communities as really amazing places. When you hear stats of 50% are not graduating, that means 50% are graduating under horrific conditions.
That's right.
So look at that 50% and just admire that. Because if you admire that, then the 50% that aren't graduating will admire that. If you're who's being admired, it's not going to work. So what I would say is look at these neighborhoods and populations in a very different lens. And actually, there is a paper that we wrote in response to the war on poverty about through a different lens. And I know Melanie Moore is the managing partner. She's here, and we have some on our website. We just have to look at people very differently.
And I just want to say a couple of things. So we talk a lot about leadership, and I'm not a big believer in leadership. I am in stewardship. Stewardship means that you're a steward of that community and that you work for that community. We often think, we don't realize that we're employed I was employed by the residents of Alameda County. I was their employee. And so that means that you listen to what your employee says. But a lot of us, we don't get that message. And if we were to listen to people in the community, they know they live there 24/7. We are visitors. We parachute in maybe once a day, maybe once a week, maybe once a month. These folk know. And so let's put our egos aside. Let's try and be ego-less. And let's listen to what they said, and let's organize around the issues that they raise, not the issues we raise. And Merce, I can't, I'm just so proud of you and for you and for us to have you in our community and doing this really outstanding work. And it's make a difference in people. If you give me a sense that I can do, that's a different sense than me always depending upon you. And our systems are based upon me depending upon you and not depending upon myself. So I want to thank you for everyone in the audience.
You're very kind.
I'm just sorry we have more time.
I also want to thank you both very much. This has been really inspiring for me. As a young person who's moving into policy, a lot of my background is very similar to Mauricio's. Growing up as a Black and Mexican female and having a single teenage Black mother, I'm not the person that people expect to be able to say, oh, I graduated from Cal, or that I'm doing these things in this community. And I live in East Oakland, in the Deep East. So I definitely sort of see the difference in people who are coming to save and people who are really invested in this community. And I just wanted to ask a really quick question, because I know that place has been a really big theme in this whole presentation, and you spoke a little bit on home ownership and how that sort of started motivating other people, knowing that they can do it themselves. But right now there seems to be a lot of questions around how we can embrace place, because Oakland is a beautiful place. East Oakland is a beautiful place. West Oakland is a beautiful place. But we also are saying, so we need to change the place to make things better for people, but how do we do that without displacing people? And is the change really, is change really what's needed, or is it a sort of building off of what's already there and understanding that culture is different?
That was a really dangerous question, Dan.
I know.
One is I don't agree with place, other than in a very broad way. For me, it's social capital. You know, what my mother needed was friends, what the refugees were their friends. It was social capital. And like, I got bigger social capital when I say I graduated from UC Berkeley.
Right.
All of a sudden, other people would relate to me
Right.
differently. So it's really about social networks and connections, not as much place. What's interesting, though, is when you're very poor and you're isolated and racism is kind of bearing down on you, you do get isolated in a place. So the place has a role, but it's not the driving force. Okay, we had families in West Oakland that their friends lived in East Oakland. They needed their friends. You know, and every time we draw a line of geography that we decide. So one of the things is this is going to really make your jobs hard. I went to lecture in UC Berkeley, and the students all said they're totally depressed. Every time, and here's the dilemma. If in your conversations you say, what should we do? And you're talking about us, starting in the wrong place. We have to stop figuring out what we can do. Until we know what they are doing, we don't know our role. And so we just have to stop. You know, like I said, we just create this vacuum of leadership and then see what the hell would happen. Then we knew our role. So it's a little hard.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Can we get one more round of applause for them? So we're going to move on to our economic empowerment panel. And so can the people on the panel move forward, please, and grab a seat. Thank you.
Interesting.
So our moderator for this panel will be Estelle Clemens. Estelle Clemens from Alameda County Oakland Community Action Partnership has devoted over